Hey everybody, this video is called Laws That May Shock You, and tonight we're going to continue our pass-through study here in the book of Deuteronomy chapter 23. And it's going to be one of those chapters where some things might make you say, whoa, or it might shock you, as you can find across the Old Testament. And so we're going to look at the instructions to the assembly, in which some may be shocked today when we go through this. So let's look at chapter 23. We'll look at verse 1, starting out. It says, "He who is emasculated by crushing or mutilation shall not enter the assembly of the Lord." So, in the last chapter, Moses speaks on the sanctification of the home and marriage. And now he proceeds into speaking on the sanctification of the union of the congregation. And he speaks of the right to citizenship, including being gathered before the presence of the Lord to worship him. In verse 1 here, it refers to the crushing or mutilation of male genitals or male private parts by could be either through birth defect, could be through accidental, or someone could actually do it on purpose like some people do today. And today, I believe Moses would add transgenders, males that are seeking to be females and even getting their genitals removed for whatever the case is. He would add them into the verse 1 there. So they would not be able to be in the assembly. And they were considered eunuchs back at this time. In verse 2, it says, "One of illegitimate birth shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord." So in verse 2, it's difficult to define, to actually give you a definition of what illegitimate child means there, or birth. And Jewish writers, they've debated this over the years, and some later defined it as one who was born through a incest relationship, while others believed it referred to those who were born of mixed races. So like by mixed marriages and all that between Israel or in different pagans. And you could find that in Nehemiah chapter 13 verse 23 for an example of someone in Israel being married to a pagan. In verse 3 through 6, it says, "An Ammonite or Moabite shall not enter the assembly of the Lord, even to the 10th generation. None of his descendants shall enter the assembly of the Lord forever, because they did not meet you with bread and water on the road when you came out of Egypt, but because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. Nevertheless, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam, but the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. You should not seek their peace, nor their prosperity, all your days forever." So the word is used forever in verses 3 and 6, and it seems to indicate, with the phrase as being an idiom, indicating permanent exclusion from the worshiping community in Israel. And in contrast, an Edomite or an Egyptian might worship in Israel in the 3rd generation, as the next 2 verses will talk about. And though these nations had been also enemies, Edom was a near relative from Jacob's family, while individual Egyptians had shown kindness to the Israelites at the Exodus, back in Exodus chapter 12 verse 36. And the Moabites and the Ammonites, they treated Israel cruelly on their way to the promised land. And they were 2 sons born to the daughters of Lot through their incest father, back in Genesis chapter 19 verse 30 through 38. In verse 7 and 8, it says, "You should not abhor an Edomite, for he is your brother. You should not abhor an Egyptian, because you are an alien in his land. The children of the 3rd generation born of them may enter the assembly of the Lord." So as mentioned, these ethnicities were permitted to be among the congregation. In verse 9 through 12, when the army goes out against your enemies, then keep yourself from every wicked thing. If there is any man among you who becomes unclean by some occurrence in the night, then he shall go outside the camp. He shall not come inside the camp. But it shall be when evening comes that he shall wash with water, and when the sun sets, he may come into the camp. Also, you shall have a place outside the camp where you may go out. And you shall have an implement among your equipment, and when you sit down outside, you shall dig with it, and turn and cover your refuse. For the Lord your God walks in the midst of your camp to deliver you and give your enemies over to you. Therefore your camp shall be holy, that he may see no unclean thing among you and turn away from you. So, because the camp of the Israelite soldiers was a place of God's presence, the camp was called to be kept clean, and the instruction was given concerning nocturnal emission and defecation. Such instruction for external cleanliness illustrated what God really wanted in the heart. In Leviticus chapter 15, verse 16 through 18, it talks more about the cleansing ceremony. In verse 15 and 16, you shall not give back to his master the slave who has escaped from his master to you. He may dwell with you in your midst in the place which he chooses within one of your gates, where it seems best to him. You shall not oppress him. So from this point on through chapter 25, Moses goes on to select 21 sample laws to further illustrate the nature of the requirements of living under the Sinaitic covenant. And a fugitive slave was not to be turned over to their master. And evidently, this has in mind a slave that came from the Canaanites or neighboring nations who were being driven out by oppression or with a desire to know Israel's God. And in verse 17 and 18, it says, there shall be no ritual harlot of the daughters of Israel, or a perverted one of the sons of Israel. You shall not bring the wages of a harlot or the price of a dog to the house of the Lord your God, for any vowed offering, for both of these are an abomination to the Lord your God. So, verse 17, 18, it talks about prostitution as being a form of worship being forbidden. And the reason why is a ritual harlot referred to a female prostitute, whereas a perverted one refers to a male prostitute. And they both were very common in pagan religions of the Canaanites and others in the ancient world. And later in 1 Kings 15 verse 12 and 2 Kings 23 verse 7, male prostitutes, they were expelled from Israel. So this stuff would happen within Israel. And they were an abomination to God. So many times in the Old Testament, most people focus on homosexuality as being an abomination. But in the Old Testament so far, in Deuteronomy, we find that God considers idolatry an abomination. It's disgusting to him. And then also male prostitutes and female prostitutes. And the pay of prostitutes were never to be offered to the Lord. And what we can gather from that is that God does not want money from people that come from immoral or ill-gotten gains. And that would be, just like today, some people might sell drugs and give that money to God. That would be a ill-gotten offering. In verse 19 and 20, you shall not charge interest to your brother, interest on money or food or anything that is lent out of interest. To a foreigner you may charge interest, but to your brother you shall not charge interest, that the Lord your God may bless you in all to which you set your hand in the land which you are entering to possess. So the prohibition of lending money at interest to a fellow Israelite is qualified by Exodus chapter 22 verse 25 and Leviticus chapter 25 verse 35 through 36. And that indicates that it restricts its application to the poor, and it further prevents impoverishment, but it was allowed for the foreigners who were engaged in trade and commerce to enlarge their wealth. And back in chapter 15 in Deuteronomy here, verse 1 and 2, it's also clear that money could be legitimately lent in the normal course of business. And it was subject, though, to forgiveness of all unpaid debt in the sabbatical year, as the next chapter is going to cover. And food mentioned, it shows that interest was prohibited among the poor on basic needs. And what I think is interesting about that is I come from the state, what I call Taxachusetts, where there's taxes for just about everything you can think of. But in Massachusetts still, they know that they should not tax food or clothing. In verse 21 through 23 says, "When you make a vow to the Lord your God, you shall not delay to pay it, for the Lord your God will surely require it of you, and it would be sin to you. But if you abstain from vowing, it shall not be sin to you. That which has gone from your lips you shall keep and perform, for you voluntarily vowed to the Lord your God what you have promised with your mouth. When you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes at your pleasure, but you shall not put any in your container." And so I read one extra verse there, but verses 21 through 23, we see that vows were made voluntarily, and they were to be promptly kept when someone made a vow, as Numbers 30.2 points out to. So when people make promises or commitments and they break those vows, they are in sin against God. And what might be normal to the world around us right now is not considered lawful with God. In verse 24-25, I'll reread 24. It says, "When you come into your neighbor's vineyard, you may eat your fill of grapes at your pleasure, but you shall not put any in your container. When you come into your neighbor's standing grain, you may pluck the heads with your hand, but you shall not use a sickle on your neighbor's standing grain." In verse 24, I like that verse because I love grapes, but that's a side note. And so farmers, they were to share their produce with the people of the land, but the people were not to profit from it. And so they were not to profit from the farmer's generosity. And so to wrap up here, we looked at those who were excluded from the congregation of Israel, such as eunuchs, and those who had unknown parentage. And like I said, Deuteronomy chapter 23, it starts right out with some verses that might be shocking to you. And the Edomites and the Egyptians of the third generation, they were permitted perhaps to be among the congregation of Israel. And we looked at miscellaneous laws such as cleanliness of the camp. And we saw that Israel was to provide a lusum for foreigners that escaped who were slaves. And Moses, he confronted sacred prostitution as it was banned. And later in the New Testament, Revelation 22:15, it even lists dogs as those who are outside the New Jerusalem. Dogs refer to male prostitutes. And I know, maybe if you were a dork like me, you thought dog was a cool name to be called back in your teenage years. But then you find in the Bible here that dog is not a good reference to have. And, we looked at the law that no interest was to be charged among the brethren, the family of Israel. And we looked at the importance of keeping the vows. And, some people today, they believe vows are not to be made at all. And they think that vows are not to be permitted at all. And I want to go over to the Sermon on the Mount, as you can find a lot of Deuteronomy. Jesus preached on it. And it says here, again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform your oaths to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, neither by heaven, for it is God's throne, nor by the earth, for it is God's footstool, nor by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. Nor shall you swear by your head, because you cannot make one hair white or black, but let your yes be yes and your no, no. For whatever is more than these is from the evil one. So Jesus, he didn't forbid oaths, but he was saying that one should be filled with such integrity that if they make an oath, that they're going to fulfill it. And, you know, oaths should be unnecessary if one had integrity. And James, he paraphrased the Sermon on the Mount as what he said in James chapter 5, verse 12. In Matthew chapter 26, and verse 63-64, says, but Jesus kept silent, and the high priest answered and said to him, I put you under oath by the living God. Tell us if you are the Christ, the Son of God. And Jesus said to him, it is as you said, nevertheless I say to you, hereafter you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the power and coming on the clouds of heaven. So Jesus at his trial was before the council and the high priest, Caiaphas, and he answered under oath. And in Luke chapter 1, verse 73, the Father swore under oath. So with the Son of God and the Father being under oath, making oaths, it can't be bad if they're doing it because God cannot sin. But, you know, we're better off not making oaths as it's not required by God. In the chapter, it ends with the right to glean is given to the travelers. And if you would like to check out a passage where Jesus and his disciples are accused by the Pharisees of doing such, but not stealing, you can check out Luke chapter 6, verses 1 through 5. And that's going to wrap up this video tonight. I hope you have a great rest of your evening. We'll be continuing tomorrow in chapter 24. God bless.